The rope came first. Late in 2025, a caver named Andrew Stemple was called out to a chamber on the Nullarbor Plain for a job that had nothing to do with discovery. He was there to rig ropes, to anchor lines, to get a survey team safely down into the dark and safely back out again. He has described his own role that day in the plainest possible terms. He was brought in his words, as a rope monkey, purely there to handle the technical work of lowering people into the chamber below. He expected to spend the day thinking about anchors and abseils and load ratings, about the ordinary, careful mechanics of not falling. He did not expect to reach the bottom, look around, and realize within minutes that the ropes were never going to be the story. What he said next, once he understood what he was standing in, was not a rigging term at all. He said they needed a bug person. The chamber is now known as Goat Cave. And inside it, in a single dark room beneath one of the most dismissed stretches of highway in the country, the team found evidence of what may be as many as 60 separate species of invertebrate, a significant number of which have quite possibly never been documented by science at all. Not 60 individuals, 60 species, sitting in the dark, under a plain that everyone who crosses it swears is empty. This is Ancient Aussie History, where we go looking for the parts of this country most people never find, and the ancient story most of us were never taught in school. Subscribe now, and if you'd rather listen, every episode is also a podcast on Spotify, link below. And leave a comment telling me what you think has been sitting undiscovered under the Nullarbor for the longest. Because by the end of this, that question stops being rhetorical. A plain everyone assumes is empty. The Nullarbor has a reputation problem, and it has earned it, honestly. To anyone driving the air highway across it, the surface presents as flat, treeless, and almost aggressively featureless, running unbroken for hundreds of kilometres in every direction. It is the stretch of road travellers describe, fairly or not, as the most boring drive in the country. A place you endure rather than visit. A blank space between the eastern states and the west that most people cross with the cruise control set and their eyes glazed. Nothing about the view from the driver's seat suggests there is anything underneath worth slowing down for. What that flat impression conceals is a limestone karst platform, one of the largest single areas of continuous limestone bedrock anywhere on Earth. And it is not solid. Beneath the surface, the plain is riddled with an estimated 10,000 identified caves and karst features, with new ones still being found on a regular basis. The entrances tend to announce themselves as sudden collapsed sinkholes in otherwise unbroken ground, some of them more than 40 metres deep and 80 metres wide, with tunnels radiating outward from the base large enough to resemble subway passages. Corridors carved by nothing but slightly acidic water and geological patience, on a scale that looks engineered but never was. Goat Cave sits inside this network. And here is the first thing worth being clear about. The cave itself was not some lost, unknown feature waiting to be stumbled upon. Cavers knew it was there. Its location was not a secret. What was unknown, what nobody had any reason to suspect, was what had been quietly accumulating in the dark inside it, undisturbed, for a length of time that nobody has yet been able to measure. That distinction matters, because it tells you something uncomfortable about how much of this country we have actually examined. A cave can be on the map, visited, rigged, and abseiled into, and still hold a discovery of this magnitude simply because nobody with the right training had ever knelt down on the floor and looked closely at what was lying on it. The Nullarbor is not unexplored in the sense of being untouched. It is unexplored in the sense that the sheer volume of what is down there has always outrun the small number of people qualified to catalogue it. 10,000 identified caves, a handful of specialists. The arithmetic alone guarantees that the majority of what exists beneath the plain has never been properly looked at by anyone. What was actually found? Once Stemple understood that the rope work was beside the point, the team called in someone who could tell them what they had walked into. Dr Jess Marsh, an arachnologist from the University of Adelaide, was brought in to assess the chamber. Her description of the moment has none of the caution scientists usually reach for. She has said, flatly, that it will take the rest of her life to properly sort through what they found. In that single chamber, the team recovered evidence of up to 60 species, and every specimen Marsh has examined so far shares one telling feature. They are all highly adapted, specifically to cave conditions, the kind of adaptation that only develops after long periods of isolation from the surface world, generation after generation, cut off from sunlight until the body reshapes itself around the dark. These are not surface animals that wandered in and got lost. These are animals built by the cave. Among the finds were 2 spider species roughly the size of a human palm. There was an eyeless spider, a known but rarely seen creature called Troglodiplura, recently identified by the same research group in a nearby cave, an animal that has surrendered its eyes entirely because, in total darkness, eyes are a cost with no return. There was a second spider, still unclassified, notable for spinning unusually large and fragile webs on long, spindly legs. And then there was the one that should not have been there at all. Perhaps the single most striking discovery from the chamber appears to be the first recorded, eyeless, cave-adapted wasp species found anywhere. Wasps are not creatures anyone associates with the deep dark of a cave. They are animals of sunlight and open air. And that is precisely what made its presence in Goat Cave stop the research team cold. Something had been living down there long enough to turn a wasp blind, the part nobody can actually explain. This is where the discovery moves from remarkable to genuinely unresolved. Because here is the detail that changes the whole character of the find. Almost none of the specimens recovered from the chamber were alive. Stempel has described the scene inside as one where everything he could see was dead. Not decayed, not scattered, dead and preserved, including cockroaches found frozen mid-climb on the chamber walls, held in the exact position they died in, legs still gripping the rock. A room full of animals stopped in the act of living, and when the scientists tried to work out how long they had been like that, they hit a wall. Marsh has been direct about it. In her own words, the specimens could be tens of years old, or they could be tens of thousands of years old. Nobody currently knows which. Sit with the size of that gap for a moment. The margin of uncertainty is not a decade or a century. It is the difference between something that died within living memory and something that died before the last ice age ended. In almost any other field, an expert asked to date a find will give you a range they can defend. Here, the most honest range the scientists could offer spans 3 orders of magnitude. And they offered it not out of carelessness, but because the chamber genuinely erases the usual clues. On the surface, decay is a clock. Things rot at a rate you can read backwards. In Goat Cave, that clock has effectively stopped, and with it went the easiest way of telling recent from ancient. The reason for that uncertainty comes down to the air in the chamber itself. The cave air is highly saline, and saline, low-oxygen cave environments are known to preserve organic material for extraordinary lengths of time, far, far beyond anything that could survive exposed on the surface. The same conditions that make the chamber hostile to life make it extraordinarily good at holding onto the dead. Whatever falls into that dark and stays there is not so much decaying as it is waiting. If you've made it this far, here is the part that ties it all together. And it is the part that reframes everything. Subscribe now if you want more of this, because the story stops being about spiders here and becomes about time. Some of the invertebrate remains recovered nearby have been linked to a separate and much stranger line of evidence. Weevils, found roughly 80 metres underground, belonging to a group that today lives exclusively on tree roots. There is no tree life anywhere near that depth on the modern Nullarbor. There is barely tree life on the surface. And yet there they were, 80 metres down, animals that only make sense in a world with roots to feed on. Researchers have suggested this points to a period when the plain supported rainforest, potentially as long as 5 million years ago, which means some of what is being pulled out of these chambers may not belong to the Australia we know at all. It may represent species and lineages that evolved, thrived, and died out during an entirely different climate era. A green, wet Nullarbor that vanished so completely that the only proof it ever existed is a handful of blind insects preserved in salt, in the dark, under a desert. To try to pin this down, Marsh and her colleagues are now working with international specialists to catalogue the material properly. That includes examining the preserved gut contents of the specimens, literally trying to read what these creatures ate in their final hours as a clue to the world they lived in, and applying carbon dating in an attempt to finally establish how old the deposit actually is. As of now, that dating work has not produced a confirmed answer. The honest position, from the people holding the specimens in their hands, is still, we don't yet know. Why this keeps happening on the Nullarbor? It would be easy to file Goat Cave away as a freak event, a 1 in a million chamber. It isn't. In a separate, unrelated cave system elsewhere in Australia, researchers recently identified an entirely new genus of giant, blind crustacean, more than 80 individuals, found in shallow pools inside a limestone chamber. It was the first time that particular family of subterranean animal had ever been documented living inside an Australian cave at all, rather than in the groundwater aquifers where the family was assumed to belong. The researchers behind that discovery were unusually blunt in their published findings. They stated plainly that large sections of the country's cave systems and groundwater have simply never been properly surveyed for this kind of life, and that further undiscovered species are considered highly likely as more caves are examined. In other words, the surprise is not that these animals exist. The surprise is that anyone bothered to look, and the expectation is that looking harder will keep turning up more. Taken together, these findings point to something the record has quietly been suggesting for years. The Nullarbor's reputation as empty, flat, and unremarkable applies only to what is visible from the seat of a car doing 110 on the highway. Beneath that surface sits a limestone network so large that no team has ever attempted a full, systematic survey of it. Chambers where organic material can apparently sit undisturbed and mummified for an unknown span of time, in conditions almost perfectly suited to preserving whatever falls into the dark and stays there. The plain is not empty. It is a sealed archive, and we have only just started reading the first page. What remains? Unknown. Dr. Marsh has been careful to stress the scale of what is still ahead. What has come out of Goat Cave so far represents, in her words, just the tip of the iceberg. Andrew Stempel, who is not a passing tourist but the president of the Australian Speleological Federation, someone who has spent a career mapping exactly these systems, has described moments like this one as the kind of thing a scientist can spend an entire career hoping to experience just once, and mostly never does. The specimens are now in the hands of international experts, being sorted, examined, and dated, and that work is expected to take years rather than months. What is already clear is this: a chamber sitting beneath one of the most travelled, most dismissed stretches of highway in the entire country has produced potentially dozens of species entirely new to science, alongside physical remains that nobody can currently place in time with any confidence at all. It might be decades old. It might be tens of thousands of years old. It might reach back to a rainforest that dried up 5 million years ago. Until the dating is finished, every one of those answers is still on the table. None of this needs a mystery invented around it. There is nothing supernatural in Goat Cave, no lost civilization, nothing that needs dressing up. The plain truth is already enough. A country that most people believe they have seen simply by driving across it, hiding a room full of blind, unnamed, perfectly preserved creatures that stopped living at some point nobody can yet name. The Nullarbor doesn't look like much at 110 kilometres an hour, but somewhere beneath the road you're driving on, in a chamber full of salt and silence, there is a record of a lost Australia that no one on the surface knew was there. And the scientists holding it in their hands will tell you, honestly, that they don't yet know how old it is. If this changed how you see a place you'd only ever driven across, leave it in the comments. And subscribe to Ancient Aussie History for more of the strange, ancient, and unresolved corners of this country hiding in plain sight.